Hey, what's going on? It's another episode of Film Streak. You know what we do here. We watch new movies. And sometimes those movies aren't new movies, but they're movies that are just new to us, right? New to me, I guess, specifically, because I'm the one doing this. But the idea is to see some new things and broaden the horizons a little bit. And it's funny because this episode is really, truly taking that to heart. You know, earlier this year, a couple months ago, I took a little break, and some of the episodes you've heard recently, they were recorded way in advance because I was off on a road trip and on vacation basically, and got to see parts of the country, got to go into the Rocky Mountains and Montana and Colorado, all that area. And it was a chance to just get out and get away. So coming back to watching films here more recently, you know, I did a lot of horror films in October, and that was great. That was fun. That was something I kind of already had in mind. But once we got through that, I thought, well, look, what kind of films do I want to see? But what I found was I was kind of still in that mindset of being on that trip and the experience of it all, of seeing new places and meeting new people and just finding a different perspective, a different appreciation for the world around me and the people around me, and some of the routines that sometimes they're mundane or tedious or boring, but understanding like why those things are necessary sometimes, and then why it's good to break away from that and challenge yourself and make yourself uncomfortable. And so I said, well, you know, there's got to be a lane of films, of stories that are about this kind of thing. There's got to be. So many places that I got to see that are not only like interesting landmarks and places of interest, but they were so cinematic, so visually kind of epic and overwhelming in some cases. So I just thought, let me look into this. Let me look at some films that really kind of try to capture this feeling, this experience of being out on your own or just exploring the countryside and what that does to someone. You know, one film that comes to mind that I saw a long time ago, I saw it when it came out, and I still think it's a beautiful film. It's probably one of the most alluring films or just magical films that I've seen. And also one of the most heartbreaking films is Into the Wild. And that was directed by Sean Penn. I think that was like, 2009, something like that. And, you know, it tells the story, the true story of, I think it's Chris McCandless, right? He's a young man. He like graduates college and he just kind of like ditches everything, just like gives away everything, gets rid of all his money and just goes traveling traveling the country all the way from, I think it's like the Grand Canyon all the way up to Alaska, and ends up unfortunately not making it, you know, gets himself into a bad situation and he never comes home. And it's a tragic story, but it's also a story of that journey of what it is to kind of get lost in the world and find something in yourself or find a strength that maybe you didn't know you had. You know, another film that I think still kind of sticks with me in some ways, and it's sort of related to this maybe, but there's a film that came out a few years ago. Actually, I think it was during the pandemic, and it's called Land. And that's with Robin Wright. And if I remember right, I think she even directed it. I think it was her directorial debut. And it's kind of a small film. It's kind of a quiet film, but it is about a woman who decides to kind of leave things behind and move up to Montana, I think it is, and just kind of live life on her own, like in a cabin in the mountains. And as the film goes on, you know, there is an aspect of her kind of confronting some things in her past, some tragedy, some trauma, and how she has to sort of heal herself, you know, find that about herself that is hurt and try and work it out. So those two films, they've always kind of stuck with me But I said there's got to be more, and maybe more specifically about this idea of like kind of walking the earth, like Caine in Kung Fu. Yeah, that's right. It's like there is a real power to that. There's a real value to being on foot and just taking one step at a time. Maybe you know your destination, maybe you don't, but it's about that process. You can kind of cheat it, but I think you do yourself a disservice if it really is about discovery, whether it's, discovering a new place or discovering something within yourself, right? I'm trying not to get into like any kind of weird self-help territory or whatever, but I'll tell you, all of these films, they worked for me specifically on that level. I've talked about it early in the podcast that a couple years ago, I lost my mother, and that was a very hard thing to go through. And for quite a while, it was hard to even really think about it. It's one thing I understand. You have to move on. You have to find a way to move forward. But it can be a thing where if you give it just the slightest thought, it can just all start to feel like things are crumbling down. And with some time, you can find that you have a resolve, right? You have a way to keep yourself together, keep your composure, and still go about your day and not totally fall to pieces. But that doesn't mean that doesn't live with you. And I think that's an important part of it is you have to keep that with you, whether you call it grief or you call it some sort of growth. You have to keep that with you, whether it's the memory of the person or what life can be and how short life can be sometimes. You have to kind of always remind yourself of that. And sometimes it's easier to do than not. Right? Sometimes it just is there, like right over your shoulder. Other times it's a little further away. You get busy with things, you get kind of distracted by things in life, and you never forget, but you feel like it's off in the distance. It still exists. So this first film, Wild, it's with Reese Witherspoon, and this is from 2014, and it's a true story. It's about Cheryl Strayed, who's a young woman who she loses her mother. She ends up having going through a divorce, and eventually just kind of hits a sort of bottom. And she's got a pretty impulsive streak. She lived pretty irresponsibly throughout her life, and she's kind of at her wit's end. And she decides she's going to do this 1,000-mile hike across the Pacific Crest Trail, which is all up along the west coast of the United States, right? And it's an interesting journey. It's an interesting look at what it takes for someone to think that they're going to do this and do it, let's say, quote unquote, the right way by preparing themselves, but maybe over preparing. And over preparing in the sense of like having all the equipment, having all the tools and the gear and whatever, but maybe having too much, like overcompensating, because it's not necessarily about having all the stuff to go with you. It's about having it inside you to do it. Or maybe some balance of the two. But to just say, like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to buy all the things and have all the things, well, that'll get you so far. But once those things just kind of become tools, it's left up to you, as a person to say, okay, can I still do this? And that is the struggle in this story that Cheryl kind of faces is, how do I reckon with everything I've done and things that have happened to me and things that I've gone through? And how do I grow beyond that or grow and kind of move forward? Like, I don't, there's a part of all of these films that is, it's a little bit hard to separate who is the actor and who is the character. And for some of these films, they're very personal and they're based on true stories. They're based on real people's experience. And I think that's the one, if you want to call it a downside to this film, is that I couldn't not see Reese Witherspoon. I couldn't see Cheryl Strayed. All that said, the story is interesting, but I think that kind of takes me out of it every time. And so, speaking of which, it's like this next film, A Walk in the Woods, this is the ultimate like stunt casting, I think. But at the same time, it is also kind of distracting. You've got Robert Redford here. Robert Redford is like a cinematic legend as an actor, also as a filmmaker and a producer. And of course, Sundance, right? Such a big, an important figure in the landscape of filmmaking, Robert Redford. It's totally playing on his persona, his sort of, his presence as an icon. He's a seasoned veteran travel writer, and he's kind of, he's like tapped out. He's like out of ideas. Like he's kind of hit, he's having writer's block. And instead of retiring and living the quiet life with his wife, with his family, he still feels that itch, that urge to do something, to find something, right? And so he decides he wants to hike the Appalachian Trail, which, I guess sort of like the Pacific Coast Trail or Pacific Crest Trail. It's a pretty serious undertaking. So he can't find anybody to go along with him. That just sounds crazy to everybody he asks. Until he gets in touch with an old friend that he hadn't seen like in a lifetime. And that's his friend that's played by Nick Nolte. And now here you have another sort of cinematic acting legend, And so these two old men, they go on this journey of hiking across this part of the country. And it's got its own kind of ups and downs and peaks and valleys, no pun. But it's a film not necessarily about someone dealing with tragedy or hardship, but it is about kind of reckoning with the past. And even, coming to grips with age and where age puts you in the world, in society, let's say. And, I got to say, it is also a comedy. It's not like a straight drama. It's got some dramatic beats in it, but it is more of a comedy. And it's not, any kind of raunchy, like hangover type of comedy. It is a comedy that feels appropriate to these two actors, maybe this generation. Because it is also definitely R-rated. And it's mostly because of language or whatever, but it does feel like if you know Robert Redford and you know Nick Nolte, they have edge to them. And I feel like people forget that, especially now that they're older. People kind of forget, like, these two guys, when they were in movies, when they were younger, oh yeah, they had plenty of bite. And this film reminds us of that. And so I just feel like, this movie is almost 10 years old. And the reason that kind of sticks out to me is I feel like this is a film you probably wouldn't see today. Like, I can't really imagine this kind of film getting off now. I mean, it's about two old guys walking in the woods, and it's R-rated, and it's very, very adult, let's say. And in the terms of it is more mature, it's for an audience that is of a certain age. Probably all these films are really like that. But this one definitely is about, one, you got to know who these two guys are for this story to really have the right impact, I think. But two, you've got to be able to see, like, someone of their age, they've gone through things. They've had certain experiences. And you kind of have to be able to connect with that. If you're like, 18 years old, 20, 25 years old, you're not going to really relate to this. I'm afraid. And that to me just makes this a little more of an interesting gem of a film that it's a little bit of a rare item. And I appreciate it for that. There are no superheroes. There are no explosions. There's, I don't even think there's a gun in the film. You know, look, they're older, and the film kind of pokes at that. It makes its own kind of comment and jokes about trying to hike a 2,000-mile trail in your 70s or 80s and not being able to do it. And yet these two guys, they are still like, they're whip smart. They're still there. They've got it. And I think that is what holds the film together. So while this film isn't based on a true story, it does feel like this is pretty close to something that could actually happen or could even happen today, right? It's not impossible. And so the next film I want to talk about here is it's a film called Wildlike. And I kept reading it as Wildlife for some reason until I actually like stopped and looked at it and tried to, understand what this was. And it's interesting. This is a film that it seems like it's one thing, and then very quickly it turns into something else. If you read the description or the synopsis or summary, I think it was on Amazon Prime, it seems like this is like about a troubled teenage girl who just decides to like run away from home and ends up pairing up with an older guy to just kind of make her way across the country. And yet that's only like half the story. And I don't mean like half in terms of there's more to the plot. I mean, that is kind of the plot, but it goes to some deeper and darker places. And not to the sense where you feel like you can't believe this situation, but just that you want to see this even more. You want to see this outcome work out for these two characters. You've got this young girl, Mackenzie. She's a teenage girl. I think in the film, she says she's 14 years old. And she's played by Ella Purnell, who most recently is in the Fallout series, and who legit looks like a kid in this movie. And it already is, once you understand what happens in the film, is her mother sends her to live with her uncle in Alaska. So she's kind of like a fish out of water. She's kind of in a place she doesn't know. She's living with someone who, look, is supposed to be a guardian, a parental figure, whatever, and a relative. But when that life starts to turn sour super fast because uncle lives by himself and takes advantage of this teenage girl, that's where you're like, oh, hell no. I understand now if this girl wants to run away. And that's what happens. And it's played very quietly. It's played very discreetly. But you clearly know what's going on, and you clearly want this girl to get out of this situation. And at that point, it's about her just trying to find a way home, which is Seattle. So that sends her on the road just on foot. And she meets up with this older guy who's out to hike in Alaska, played by Bruce Greenwood, who... I just got to take a moment, shout out Bruce Greenwood, who's been like a solid performer in just about everything I've seen him in, really. I think the first one I probably saw him in was Exotica, maybe. And I didn't really know who he was, but I just remember him being like a big part of that film and being like, who is this guy? Like he's got like a sort of weight and a sort of intensity, but also a tenderness and a fatherliness to him. And in this film, that all of that comes into play. He is someone who is out on a hike out in this part of the country for his own reasons. And I feel like there's even a subtext here of like why he's here and why he doesn't want to have to deal with this girl. And it doesn't really get talked about, I don't think. But when he kind of abandons that and decides to help this girl and get her home or get her somewhere, I think the film kind of takes on a different tone. It does start out kind of somber, and then it gets dark, and then it starts to turn into there's like a ray of light. And even by the end of the film, though, it's a little ambiguous about what exactly happens to these characters. Because I feel like there's a very easy way to get us to a good, satisfying, happy ending. But this film doesn't quite get us there. And I think it's by choice. I think it just decides like, look, some of this stuff is going to be unresolved, and some of it, it's going to have to be confronted. And when we get to that moment, that's when we cut the credits. And so part of me is like, that's a really interesting choice. And when you really rely on these two actors to make this work, I think it feels right. It's probably not going to feel satisfying necessarily, but it feels right, if that makes sense. So I really actually enjoyed that approach to it. The next film I want to talk about is a film that I think is such an interesting story, and yet it's saddled with the entirely wrong sort of perception. It's this film from 2020 called The Dark Divide, and it stars David Cross. Somebody just did this film dirty because it looks like it's some kind of monster movie. Even the title doesn't work, because this film is not that at all. This film is about a man who is hiking through the Pacific Northwest, and he's not just hiking. He's there he's like a butterfly researcher or something. He's like an expert in the field, and he's on this journey to discover new species and to catalog them and to just learn about this part of the country and all that. And then as the film goes on, we start to understand why he's there. And we start to understand parts of his past that have led him to this moment where his wife, played by Deborah Messing, was sick with cancer. And one of her challenges was the day she's gone, she has to do something for him. And that turns out to be that he gets this grant to take on this research project. But that means he's got to be, I don't remember if it's a specific like park or like just this part of the country. He's got to be there for 30 days on this research trip. And so he, as a tribute, I guess, as a sort of obligation, he takes it on and he does it. And he knows his stuff in terms of the science, but he doesn't know this sort of thing about being in the field in this part of the country. So he's underprepared. And, you know, it's David Cross. So part of me figured, oh, this is going to have some comedy or maybe a lot of comedy. And turns out it really doesn't. There is some element of it that is humorous, let's say. But this is much more of a dramatic role. And, you know, for David Cross, for his style of comedy, or I feel like what I know of his style of comedy, I can't really say I'm a big fan. I probably don't even really know very much of it. But this was a surprise. And I feel like I kind of get it now. Like seeing him in this role, playing this character in this situation, you know, he's portraying a real person. He's portraying a real man. And yet, I don't know, there's sort of a sadness or there's a vulnerability to the way he plays this role that it draws you in, I think. I mean, some of it is like, if you are a big fan of David Cross, you'd probably be like, I can't not see David Cross. I understand that. But on the other hand, it's like, if you just watch like what he's doing here, like there's a part of this is like, okay, this is a fish out of water. He's unprepared. He doesn't really understand what he's in for. But when the film really gets going and we see him make the turn from being someone who is just tasked with doing this to someone who is starting to appreciate and find themselves in this, I think that's where he really turns on, you know, both engines and just makes it go. Because there's a big heart to this film. And I think you feel it. I mean, it's in the writing, of, I guess, but a lot of it is in the performance. And, you know, I think if there's one thing to it, is like, well, here's where David Cross is the right guy for this film, for this, whoever played this character, is like, you've got to go to some really vulnerable, and you got to make some choices. And this works. I mean, especially towards the end when he finds himself lost and he ends up in a cave. And it's a very interesting approach to telling this story of a man who's dealing with grief and loss and maybe some regret or some remorse, maybe not doing the things he should have done or doing the right things, or, you know, being the husband or the person he could have been, and to finding a sort of peace with that, you know, and moving forward. So this one, it's such a shame that this film is struck with the wrong kind of imagery for it. You know, if I'm looking at IMDb right now and I see the poster for it here that's on IMDb, and this works, right? It doesn't quite tell you what this film is, but it doesn't tell you what it's not. Because if you look at on, I think it's Amazon Prime or maybe one of the other streamers, the cover art, the imagery used for it, it makes it feel like it's some kind of Bigfoot horror film. And it's not that at all. And there is an element in the film that I feel like, all right, a splash of wackiness comes in, where this subtext of, is Bigfoot real? That kind of runs through the film just under the surface. And it's never really a big part of it until maybe one point towards the end of the film. But it's not even clear. It's not even like, oh, Bigfoot is a thing. It's just a charming little thing, a little piece to put into the film. This really is about this character and his sort of struggle and his discovery of himself. So on that ground alone, it's like I feel like this film is not getting the right due. But it's worth a watch. I think it's worth a watch, especially if you like David Cross. I mean, this might show you kind of a different side of him as a performer and as an actor, I suppose. The last film I want to talk about here, it's a film called Tracks. And this is from, this is from 2013. So it's not quite recent, but this is also based on a true story. This is about a young woman, Robin Davidson, who is from Australia, and she decides to basically walk across the country, right? Walk all the way from Western Australia all the way to the Indian Ocean. And of course, Australia is more probably known for its desert, the outback. So it's a departure from these other films, but the journey is very similar. This is about a woman who's dealing with tragedy in her life and dealing with a sort of a discontent. This is someone who is not satisfied with her life. And so she decides she's going to take this journey across the country. She takes 4 camels with her and she takes a dog, and that's it. And, this is a very different journey in terms of it's a different part of the world. It's a different culture. We see not only her interaction with Australian people around her and their kind of skepticism of this and their sort of negativity about her being able to do this, but we also see her interactions with the Aboriginal people there and the sort of tenderness and the warmth that they show her, even though she's kind of not necessarily intruding, but she's definitely the outsider in the equation. It's handled delicately enough where I think we understand how she gets the okay to move through that part of the country and to just be on her own. Part of that is also like she has to deal with a photographer who is partly responsible for getting her the money, getting her the ability to do this, because she needs, the camels. She needs to be able to make it across with some sort of support. So he is played by Adam Driver. He's a photographer, and he helps her as a photojournalist get the funding from a magazine to do this journey. But in the meanwhile, the sort of trade-off is that he's going to be there to help her, but also is kind of like in her way sometimes. Like is looking at it as more like an opportunity versus like this is like a personal thing that she's trying to do. I think the film makes it enough of a point to say like, well, look, I just want to do this for myself. I'm not doing this for status or for an audience or for any sort of publicity. I'm just doing this for me. And I think that's the important thing with all of these stories is these people aren't doing this for any other goal really other than themselves. And, I think this film, it really pushes this to the extreme. I mean, this character of Robin, played by Mia Wasikowska, who, I don't really feel like I've seen in a lot of films, but I recognize her. I know I've seen her in something. But this is really a stripped down sort of bare bones approach to this. I mean, she plays this, I think with a certain, there's like a harshness to her of like, I just don't want to be around people. But there's also like an openness and a tenderness that She's wounded and she's looking for some sort of healing out of this. And meanwhile, throughout the film, it's like she's played as just like dirty and sunburnt and disheveled and kind of unorganized, but she's still driven. She's still determined. It's an interesting combination, you know, because you see someone who was clearly struggling, and yet they know what they need to do for themselves, even if it seems impossible. And I think for all of us, for most people, that is what it has to come to sometimes. And so seeing it in a film like this and seeing it in such a different, let's say a different part of the world, a different setting, it reminds you that this kind of thing really is universal. You know, I think all of us in some way have to go through something like this, whether it's a time or an event. And whether it's a certain part of the world or not, it's something that it crosses all boundaries of looking for resolution, looking for closure, looking for peace. So all of these films really do work that story. I think for the most part, they all kind of get us to a place where we see someone grow and someone find something new or something bigger or stronger within themselves. In a personal way, it's like, I understand that. I've felt that on my own trip, on my own travels here recently, kind of carrying some things with me as I walked out the door. I haven't necessarily put those things down, but I can look at them in a new way now. And I think that's all you can ask for, you know? These are really interesting films, I think, and especially if you are someone who, you know, is dealing with loss or dealing with challenges that maybe you don't quite know how to handle. I'm not saying go hike, you know, all the way across the country, but think about getting outside of your routine, getting outside of yourself in a way, and looking at things just from another perspective, or just kind of clearing the slate for a little bit. Because I think that can do wonders, more than you probably expect. So anyway, you want to hear some other episodes, go to filmstreak.com. You can find plenty of other episodes there. We're up to 500, going on 550 films, I think now. If you want to see a list of all of these films, all 500 and whatever, in the meantime, hey, if you're going to take a trip out into the world, just be careful, wear good shoes, watch the skies, and maybe you'll see something new.